Pell, Central Cylinder, 9952, 1200 hours. Josh sank down to the matting, sat, collapsed backward, in the gym's reduced G. Damon leaned over him, hands on bare knees, the suspicion of amusement on his face. "I'm done," Josh said when he had a breath. His sides hurt. "Had exercised, but not this much." Damon sank to his knees by him on the mat, hunched and himself hard breathing. "Doing all right, anyhow. I'm ready to call it." He sucked air and let out a slower breath, grinned at him. "Need help?" Josh grunted and rolled over, heaved himself up on one arm, gathered himself graciously to his feet, shaking in every muscle, and conscious of the men and women in better form who passed them on the steep track, which belted all Pell's inner core. It was a crowded place, echoing with shouted conversation. It was freedom, and the worst there was to fear here was a little laughter. He would have kept going if he could. Had already run longer than he should, but he hated to have the time end. His knees shook, and his belly ached. "Come on," Damon said, rising with more ease. Damon caught his arm and guided him towards the dressing rooms. "Take a steam bath. A chance to get the knots out at least. I've got a little while before I have to get back to the office." They went into the chaotic locker room, stripped, and tossed the clothing into the common laundry. Towels were stacked there for the taking. Damon tossed a couple at him and showed him into the door marked steam, through a quick shower into a series of cubbyholes obscured by vapor. Down a long aisle. Most places were occupied. They found a few vacant toward the end of the row, took one in the middle, and sat down on the wooden benches. So much water to waste. Josh watched Damon dip up water and pour it on his head, cast the rest on a plate of hot metal until the steam boiled up and obscured him in a white cloud. Josh doused himself after similar fashion, mopped with the towel, short of breath and dizzy in the heat. "You all right?" Damon asked him. He nodded, anxious not to spoil the time. Anxious all the while he was with Damon. He desperately tried to maintain his balance, walking the line of too much trust on the one side, and on the other, a terror of trusting anyone. He hated being alone. Had never... Sometimes certainties flashed out of his tattered memory, firm as truth. Have never liked being alone. Damon would tire of him. The novelty would wear off. Such company as his had to pall after a while. And then he would be alone, with half his mind in a token freedom, in this prison that was Pell. "Something bothering you?" "No." And desperately, to change the subject, for Damon had complained he lacked company coming to the gym. "I thought Eileen would meet us here." "Pregnancy is beginning to slow her down a little. She's not feeling up to it." "Oh." He blinked, looked away. It was an intimacy, such a question. He felt like an intruder, naive in such things. Women, he thought he had known, but not pregnant ones. Not a relationship, as it was between Damon and Eileen, full of permanencies. He remembered someone he had loved. Older, drier, past such things. A boy's love. He had been the child. He tried to follow the threads where they led, but they tangled. He did not want to think of Eileen in that regard. Could not. He recalled warnings. Psychological impairment, they had called it. Impairment. "Josh, are you all right?" He blinked again, which would become a nervous tic if he let it. "Something's eating at you." He made a helpless gesture in reply, not wanting to be trapped into discussion. "I don't know." "You're worried about something." "Nothing." "Don't trust me?" The blink obscured his vision. Sweat was dripping into his eyes. He mopped his face. "All right," Damon said, as if it were. He got up, walked to the door of the wooden cubicle, anything to put distance between them. His stomach was heaving. Josh. A dark place. A close place. He could run, clear this closeness, these demands on him. That would get him arrested, sent back to hospital, into the white walls. Are you scared? Damon asked him plainly. It hit as close to the mark as any other word. He made a helpless gesture, uncomfortable. Elsewhere, the noise of other voices became like silence, a roar in which their own cell was remote. You figure what? Damon said. That I'm not honest with you? No. That you can't trust me? No. What then? He was close to being sick. He hit that barrier when he crossed his conditioning. Knew what it was. I wish, Damon said, that you'd talk. He looked back, his back to the wooden partition. You'll stop, he said numbly, when you get tired of the project. Stop what? Are you back on that desertion theme again? Then what do you want? You think you're a curiosity, Damon asked him. Or what? He swallowed the bile risen in his throat. You get that impression, do you? Damon asked. From Aline and me? Don't want to think that, he managed to say finally. But I am a curiosity, whatever else. No, Damon said. A muscle in his face began to jerk. He reached for the bench, sat down, tried to stop the tic. There were pills. He was no longer on them. He wished he were. To be still and not to think. To get out of here. Break off this probing at him. We like you, Damon said. Is something wrong with that? He sat there, paralyzed, his heart hammering. Come on, Damon said, gathering himself up. You've had enough heat. Josh pulled himself to his feet, finding his knees weak, his sight blurring from the sweat and the temperature and the reduced G. Damon offered a hand. He flinched from it, walked after Damon down the aisle and into the showers at the end of the room. The cooler mist cleared his head somewhat. He stayed in the stall a few moments longer than need be, inhaled the cooling air, came out again somewhat calmed, walked towel-wrapped into the locker room again. Damon was behind him. I'm sorry, he told Damon, for things in general. Reflexes, Damon said. He frowned intensely, caught his arm before he could turn aside. Josh flinched back against the locker so hard it echoed. A dark place, a chaos of bodies, hands on him. He jerked his mind away from it, leaned shivering against the metal, staring into Damon's anxious face. Josh? I'm sorry, he said again. I'm sorry. You look like you're going to pass out. Was it the heat? Don't know, he murmured. Don't know. He reached towards the bench, sat down to catch his breath. It was better after a moment. The dark receded. I am sorry. He was depressed, convinced Damon would not long tolerate him. The depression spread. Maybe I'd better check back into the facility. That bad? He did not want to think of his own room, the barren apartment in hospice, blank-walled, cheerless. There were people he knew in the hospital, doctors who knew him, who could deal with these things, and whose motives he knew were limited to duty. I'll call the office, Damon said, and tell them I'm going to be late. I'll take you to the hospital if you feel you need it. He rested his head on his hands. I don't know why I do this, he said. I'm remembering something. I don't know what. It hits me in the stomach. Damon sat down astride the bench, just sat and waited on him. I can figure, Damon said finally, and he looked up, recalling uneasily that Damon had had access to all his records. What do you figure? Maybe it was a little close in there. A lot of the refugees panic at crowding. It scarred into them. But I didn't come in with the refugees, he said. I remember that. And what else? A tick jerked at his face. He rose, began to dress, and after a moment, Damon did likewise. Other men came and went about them. Shouts from outside reached into the room when the door opened, the ordinary noise of the gym. Do you really want me to take you to the hospital? Damon asked finally. He shrugged into his jacket. No, I'll be all right. He judged that such was the case. Although his skin was still drawn and chill, the clothes should have warmed away. Damon frowned, gestured toward the door. They walked out into the cold outer chamber, entered the lift with half a dozen others, rode it the dizzying straight drop into outer shell G. Josh drew a deep breath, staggered a little in walking off, stopped as the flow of traffic swirled about him. Damon's hand closed on his elbow, moved him gently in the direction of a seat along the corridor wall. He was glad to sit down, to rest a moment and watch the people pass them. They were not on Damon's office level, but on a green one. The strains of music from the concourse floated out to them from the far end. They should have ridden it on down. Had stopped. Damon's idea. Near the track around to the hospital, he reasoned, or just a place to rest. He sat, taking his breath. A little dizzy, he confessed. Maybe it would be better if you went back at least for a checkup. I should never have encouraged you to this. It's not the exercise. He bent, rested his head in his hands, drew several quiet breaths, straightened finally. Damon, the names. You know the names in my records. Where was I born? Cytine. My mother's name. Do you know it? Damon frowned. No, you didn't say. Mostly you talked about an aunt. Her name was Mavis. The older woman's face came to him again, a warm rush of familiarity. I remember. Had you forgotten even that? The tick came back to his face. He tried not to acknowledge it, desperate for normalcy. I have no way to know, you understand. What's memory and what's imagination, or dreams? Try dealing with things when you don't know the difference and can't tell. The name was Mavis? Yes, you lived on a farm. He nodded, treasuring a sudden glimpse of sunlit road, a weathered fence. He was often on that road in his dreams, bare feet in slick dust, a house, a prefab and peeling dome, many such field upon field, ripe gold in the sun. Plantation, a lot larger than a farm. I lived there. I lived there until I went into the service school. That was last time I was ever on a world, wasn't it? You never mentioned any other. He sat still a moment, holding on to the image, excited by it, by something beautiful and warm and real. He tried to recover details, the size of the sun in the sky, the color of sunsets, the dusty road that led to and from the small settlement, a large, soft, comfortable woman, and a thin, worried man who spent a lot of time cursing the weather. The pieces fit, settled into place. Home. That was home. He ached after it. Damon, he said, gathering courage, for there was more than the pleasant dream. You don't have any reason to lie to me, do you? But you did, when I asked you for the truth a while ago, about the nightmare. Why? Damon looked uncomfortable. I'm scared, Damon. I'm scared of lies. Do you understand that? Scared of other things. He stammered uncontrollably, impatient with himself, with muscles that jerked and a tongue that would not frame things and a mind like a sieve. Give me names, Damon. You've read the record. I know you have. Tell me how I got to Pell. When Russell's collapsed, like everyone else. No, starting with Cytine. Give me names. Damon laid an arm along the back of the bench, faced him, frowning. The first service you mentioned was a ship named Kite. I don't know how many years. Maybe it was the only ship. You've been taken off the farm, I take it, into the service school, whatever you call the place, and you were trained in arms comp. I take it that the ship was a very small one. Scout and recon, he murmured, and saw in his mind the exact boards, the cramped interior of Kite, where the crew had to hand over hand their way in 0G. A lot of time at Fargon Station, a lot of time there, and out on patrol, out on missions just looking for what they could see. Kitha and Lee. Childlike Kitha. He had had particular affection for her. And Ulf. He recovered faces, glad to remember them. They had worked close, in more than one sense, for the Dart ships had no cabins, no privacy. They had been together years. Dead now. It was like losing them again. Watch it, Kitha had yelled. He had yelled something too, realizing they were blind-spotted. Ulf's mistake. He sat helpless at his board. No guns that would bear on the threat. He flinched from it. They picked me up, he said. Someone did. A ship named Tigris hit you, Damon. They picked me up, he said. Someone did. A ship named Tigris hit you, Damon said. Rider ship. But it was a freighter in the area that homed in on your capsule signal. Go on. Damon stayed silent a moment as if he were thinking on it, as if he would not. He grew more and more anxious, his stomach taut. You were brought onto station, Damon said finally, aboard a merchanter, a stretcher case, but no injuries. Shock, cold, I suppose. Your life support had started to fade and they nearly lost you. He shook his head. That much was blank, remote, and cold. He recalled docs, doctors, interrogation, endless questions. Mobs. Shouting mobs. Docs and a guard falling. Someone had coldly shot the man in the face while he lay on the ground stunned. Dead everywhere. Trampled. A surge of bodies before him and men about him. Armored troops. They've got guns, someone had shouted, and panic broke out. You were picked up at Mariner, Damon said, after it blew, when they were hunting Mariner survivors. Lillian? They questioned you at Russell's, Damon said softly, doggedly. They were facing, I don't know what. They were frightened, in a hurry. They used illegal techniques, like adjustment. They wanted information out of you, timetables, ship movements, the whole thing. But you couldn't give it to them. You were on Russell's when the evacuation began, and you were moved to this station. That's what happened. A dark umbilical from station to ship, troops and guns. On a warship, he said. Norway. His stomach nodded. Mallory and Norway. Graf. He remembered. Pride died there. He became a nothing. Who he was, what he was, they had not cared among the troops, the crew. It was not even hate, but bitterness and boredom, cruelty in which he did not matter, a living thing that felt pain, felt shame, screamed when the horror became overwhelming, and realizing there was no one at all who cared, stopped screaming, or feeling, or fighting. Want to go back to them? He could hear even the tone of Mallory's voice. Want to go back? He had not wanted that. Had wanted nothing then, but to feel nothing. This was the source of the nightmares, the dark, confused figures, the thing that wakened him in the night. He nodded slowly, accepting that. You entered detention here, Damon said. You were picked up. Russell's, Norway, here. If you think we've thrown anything false into your adjustment, no. Believe me, Josh. He was sweating. Felt it. I'm all right, he said, although it was hard, for a moment, to draw breath. His stomach kept heaving. Closeness, emotional or physical, was going to do this to him. He identified it now, tried to control it. Sit there, Damon said, rose before he could object and went into one of the shops along the hall. He rested there obediently, head against the wall behind him, his pulse easing finally. It occurred to him that it was the first time he had been loose, alone, save for the track between his job and his room in the old hospice. Being so gave him a peculiarly naked feeling. He wondered if those who passed knew who he was. The idea frightened him. You will remember some things, the doctor had told him, when they stopped the pills, but you can get distance from them. Remember some things. Damon came back, bringing 2 cups of something, sat down and offered one to him. It was fruit juice and something else, iced and sugared, which soothed his stomach. You're going to be late getting back, he recalled. Damon shrugged and said nothing. I'd like... To his intense shame, he stammered. To take you and Aline to dinner. I have my job now. I have some credit above my hours. Damon studied him a moment. All right. I'll ask Aline. It made him feel a great deal better. I'd like, he said further, to walk back home from here. Alone. All right. I needed to know what I remember. I apologize. I'm worried for you, Damon said, and that profoundly touched him. But I walk by myself. What night for dinner? You and Aline decide. My schedule is rather open. It was poor humor. Damon dutifully smiled at it, finished his drink. Josh sipped the last of his and stood up. Thank you. I'll talk to Aline. Let you know the date tomorrow. And call me, if you need. Josh nodded, turned, walked away, among the crowds who might know his face. Like those on the docks, in his memory. Crowds. It was not the same. It was a different world, and he walked in it, down his own portion of hall as the newfound owner of it. Walked to the lift along with those born to Pell, stood with them waiting on the lift car as if he were ordinary. It came. Green 7. He spoke up for himself when the press inside cut him off from the controls and someone kindly pressed it for him. Shoulder to shoulder in the car, he was all right. It whisked him down to his own level. He excused his way past passengers who gave him not a second glance, stood in his own corridor, near the hospice. Tally! Someone said, startling him. He glanced to his right, at uniformed security guards. One nodded pleasantly to him. His pulse raced and settled. The face was distantly familiar. You live here now? The guard asked him. Yes, he said, and in apology. I don't remember well from before. Maybe you were there when I came in. I was, the guard said. Good to see you came out all right. He seemed to mean it.
Thank you,
Josh said, walked on his way and the guards on theirs. The dark, which had advanced, retreated.
He had thought them all dreams. But I don't dream it,
he thought.
It happened.
He walked past the desk at the entry to the hospice, down the corridor inside to number 18. He used his card. The door slid aside and he walked into his own refuge, a plain, windowless place. A rare privilege from what he had heard of Vid about the overcrowding everywhere. More of Damon's arranging. Ordinarily, he would turn on the Vid, using its noise to fill the place with voices, for dreams filled the silences. He sat down now on the bed, simply sat there a time in the silence, probing the dreams and the memories like half-healed wounds. Norway. Signe Mallory. Mallory.